I am Madeline, 30 years old. Just 12 hours before my $150,000 wedding, I stood outside my sister's living room door. I came to deliver a surprise gift, but instead I found a nightmare. My fiancé, my sister, and my parents were inside, laughing about the baby growing in my sister's stomach. A baby that belonged to my future husband. They were planning to let me walk down the aisle just so they could drain my bank accounts. My heart stopped. But I did not cry. Instead, I pulled out my phone, pressed record, and prepared a wedding gift they would never forget. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your heart broken by the people who were supposed to protect you. Tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I had spent the last 2 years planning a massive, flawless wedding to Jason. Everyone in our affluent Chicago suburb thought Jason, a handsome financial advisor, was the catch of the century. My parents, William and Caroline, constantly bragged about his country club pedigree to anyone who would listen. They always reminded me how incredibly lucky I was that a man of his elevated social status wanted to marry a mid-level IT help desk worker like me. That was the lie I let them believe. They thought I made $60,000 a year fixing computer glitches. They had absolutely no idea I was an elite cybersecurity consultant. They did not know that just 3 months ago I had quietly sold a proprietary data encryption algorithm to a major tech firm for $12 million. I paid for the entire $150,000 wedding in cash, transferring the funds secretly to let my parents pretend to their snobby friends that they were footing the bill. I just wanted peace. I wanted to be loved. At 11 at night, rain was pouring down on the pristine streets of my sister Sydney's upscale neighborhood. I had just picked up the custom-engraved bridesmaid jewelry, a final surprise for her to wear tomorrow. Sydney was 28, the golden child of the family. She lived in a massive luxury condo completely paid for by her husband Terrence. Terrence, 34, is a brilliant African-American trauma surgeon from a highly respected medical family. He works insane 80-hour weeks saving lives, while Sydney spends his hard-earned money on designer bags and champagne lunches with our parents. Terrence was the only person in the extended family who ever treated me with genuine respect. I used my spare key to enter Sydney's house, shaking the rain off my coat in the foyer. The lights were on in the living room, casting a warm glow into the hallway. I walked down the dark corridor ready to announce myself when I heard Jason's voice. "Are you absolutely sure Terrence does not suspect anything?" Jason asked. I froze mid-step. Why was my fiancé at my sister's house at 11 o'clock the night before our wedding? Sydney laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Terrence is at the hospital pulling another double shift. He is completely clueless. He actually thinks this pregnancy is a miracle after we stopped trying last year." My blood ran completely cold. Pregnancy. Sydney was pregnant. My hands began to tremble. Then my mother, Caroline's voice drifted through the hallway. "You two need to be careful. The wedding is tomorrow. Jason, you just need to get Madeline down that aisle and sign that marriage certificate. Once you are legally tied to her, you will have access to her savings. Her credit is flawless. We can leverage her accounts to clear out your gambling debts before those bookies come collecting." Gambling debts. My perfect financial advisor fiancé was drowning in secret debt. The floor felt like it was dropping out from under me. My father, William, chimed in, the ice clinking loudly in his Scotch glass. "Exactly. Madeline is obedient and desperate for approval. She will not ask questions when you ask her to co-sign the new business loans. Once we get the capital to save my real estate firm from bankruptcy, you and Sydney can figure out your little living situation." I leaned against the hallway wall, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle a gasp. They were using me. My entire family was using me. My parents were secretly broke, Jason was in massive debt, and Sydney was pregnant with his child. I was nothing but a convenient credit score to them. "What about Terrence?" Jason asked nervously. "His family has serious generational wealth. If he finds out the baby is mine, his lawyers will annihilate Sydney in the divorce. He will leave her with nothing." "Oh, do not worry about the good doctor," my mother said dismissively. "Sydney has already been documenting false claims of his temper. Next month, she is going to file a police report for domestic abuse." A trauma surgeon cannot survive an abuse charge. The hospital board will suspend his license immediately. We will force a massive quiet settlement to make the charges go away, and she keeps the luxury condo and gets permanent alimony. I felt physically sick. Terrence was a good, honorable man. My parents had always treated him with subtle racial microaggressions, masking their deep prejudice behind fake, polite smiles. They only tolerated him because of his massive surgeon salary. Now they were plotting to destroy his career and his life just to fund their fake, wealthy lifestyle. I did not cry. The tears simply refused to come. Instead, my cybersecurity training kicked in. Cold, clinical logic replaced the heartbreak. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera, and hit record. I captured the final 10 seconds of them clinking their crystal glasses to their brilliant, evil master plan. Then I lifted my foot and kicked the slightly ajar living room door wide open. It slammed against the wall with a deafening crack. 4 heads snapped toward me. The color drained from Jason's face so fast he looked like a ghost. Sydney dropped her expensive wine glass. It shattered into 100 pieces on the pristine hardwood floor. My mother gasped, covering her mouth in sheer horror, while my father slowly set his scotch glass down, his hands shaking. I stood in the doorway, rain dripping from my coat, holding my phone up. I ended the recording with a quiet, sharp beep that echoed in the silent room. "Madeline?" Jason stammered, taking a desperate step forward, his hands raised in surrender. "Baby, how long have you been standing there? I swear, whatever you just heard, it is not what it sounds like." I looked at the man I was supposed to marry in 12 hours. Then I looked at the sister who had always despised me, and the parents who viewed me as nothing but a financial lifeline. The absolute betrayal was suffocating, but my mind was crystal clear. I slowly lowered my arm and tossed the velvet box containing Sydney's custom bridesmaid jewelry onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy final thud. "I just came to drop off your gift, Sydney," I said, my voice eerily calm. The total lack of emotion in my tone seemed to terrify them more than if I had screamed or thrown things. "Congratulations on the baby. I hope he inherits his father's gambling habits so you two have something to bond over when Terrence throws you out on the street." My mother rushed forward, her face twisted in panic. "Madeline, please be reasonable. Do not do anything crazy. Let us sit down and talk about this as a family." "We are not a family," I replied, looking right through her fake tears. "We are just people who share a bloodline. I will see you all tomorrow at the altar. Do not be late. I am paying for the photographer by the hour." Before any of them could process my words or say another lie, I turned on my heel and walked out the front door, stepping back into the freezing rain. My phone was already in my hand, my thumb hovering over Terrence's contact name. The wedding was absolutely still happening, but it was no longer going to be a celebration. It was going to be a public execution. I sat in my car, the engine running, while rain hammered the windshield. My thumb pressed Terrence's contact name. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the exhausted gravel of a man in the middle of a brutal trauma shift. I told him I truly needed to see him immediately. It was a matter of life and death, just not medical. He asked no questions. He simply told me to name the place. I chose the lounge at an upscale downtown hotel. It was discreet, open late, and far enough away from my family's pristine suburban bubble. I arrived at 1 in the morning. The lounge was nearly empty, bathed in amber light and smelling of expensive leather. I ordered sparkling water, waiting in a corner booth, staring at the condensation. 20 minutes later, Terrence walked in. He was still wearing his blue hospital scrubs under a dark overcoat, looking every bit the exhausted surgeon. He slid into the booth across from me, his dark eyes scanning my face with immediate concern. He asked if I was okay, noting with a forced smile that I was supposed to walk down the aisle in 13 hours. I slid my phone across the table. I told him to listen to an audio file warning him that what he was about to hear would destroy his life. Terrence frowned, leaning forward as he hit play. The microphone captured every word flawlessly. First Jason's anxious questions, then Sydney's mocking laughter as she confirmed Terrence suspected nothing about her pregnancy. Finally, my parents outlining their plan to frame Terrence for domestic abuse to secure permanent alimony, while planning to bleed my finances dry to save their failing real estate firm. I watched Terrence's face as the recording played. I expected him to shout, to slam his fist on the table, to break down and cry. Instead, a terrifying, absolute stillness washed over him. He listened to the entire clip without moving a muscle. When the audio finally finished with the sickening sound of my parents clinking their glasses, Terrence slowly pushed the phone back across the table. His jaw was locked so tightly a muscle twitched near his temple. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. He said he had always known William and Caroline despised him. We both knew the ugly truth. My parents were obsessed with their country club status and their rigid, outdated social hierarchy. They had always treated Terrence with thinly veiled racial microaggressions. My mother would constantly make passive-aggressive comments about his background, while my father loved to parade Terrence around at networking dinners, exclusively to brag about having a top-tier trauma surgeon in the family. They tolerated his race only because his massive income funded Sydney's extravagant lifestyle, and by extension bolstered their own fake image of wealth to their peers. Terrence looked down at his hands, absorbing the devastating reality that his wife, the woman he had bought a luxury condo for, was carrying a child belonging to my fiancé. He asked me how badly Jason was going to hurt me financially tomorrow. He assumed, like everyone else, that Jason and I had taken out massive loans to cover the lavish ceremony. I took a slow sip of my water and looked Terrence dead in the eye. I told him my family severely miscalculated my net worth. They genuinely believed I was just a mid-level IT worker scraping by on a tiny salary. I leaned across the table and revealed the truth. I told Terrence about the proprietary cybersecurity algorithm I had built and sold 3 months ago. I told him about the $12 million sitting safely in offshore accounts managed by my ruthless wealth manager, Elias. I explicitly stated I paid for the $150,000 wedding in cash. There were no loans, there was no debt for Jason to hijack. I owned every single vendor contract, every flower arrangement, and every chair in that enormous ballroom. Terrence leaned back against the leather booth, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. The realization hit him. My parents and Sydney were banking on a financial trap that simply did not exist. They were trying to rob an empty vault while eagerly handing me the keys to their complete destruction. Terrence asked what the plan was, assuming I was going to cancel the wedding in the morning and serve them all with lawsuits. I shook my head. I told him canceling the wedding would be entirely too easy. If I called it off, they would scurry back into the shadows, play the victims, and twist the narrative to make me look like a hysterical, jealous bride. They would find another way to trap him with the fake domestic abuse charges, and they would undoubtedly find another victim for Jason to drain. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. I told Terrence that tomorrow afternoon, 300 of Chicago's most elite socialites, including his highly influential medical family, and Jason's conservative parents, would be sitting in the grand ballroom of the country club. I proposed we let them put on their expensive suits and dresses. I proposed we let my parents smile for the cameras and pretend they were royalty. Terrence's eyes darkened with perfect, chilling understanding of the trap we were building. We formed a cold, calculated pact right there in the dim light of the hotel bar. We were not going to cancel the wedding. We were going to attend it. We were going to let them walk blindly right into the absolute center of their own trap. Tomorrow was not going to be a joyful celebration of love or family loyalty. We were going to turn the most anticipated social event of the season into a highly publicized, inescapable public execution. 13 hours later, the bridal suite at the Oakbrook Country Club was a hurricane of tulle hairspray and frantic energy. The warm morning sun streamed gracefully through the massive bay windows, catching the enormous crystal chandeliers and reflecting brightly off the endless rows of polished champagne flutes. I sat perfectly still while 2 makeup artists contoured my cheekbones and pinned my hair into an intricate updo. I stared at my reflection in the gilded vanity mirror. The woman looking back at me was a masterpiece of deception. Not a single trace of devastation from the night before showed on my face. I was the absolute picture of a blissful, deeply in love bride. The heavy oak door swung open and my mother walked in, clutching a clipboard like a shield. She looked tense, her eyes darting toward me with a flicker of apprehension. She was clearly trying to gauge if the storm from last night was going to break. I gave her a bright, glowing smile. I told her the floral arrangements looked absolutely stunning and thanked her for everything. I watched the tension immediately melt from her shoulders. She exhaled a long, shaky breath, visibly gaslighting herself right in front of my very own eyes. In her mind, my dramatic exit into the freezing rain was just severe pre-wedding jitters. I was just an overwhelmed bride who heard nothing and suspected nothing. She walked over, gently kissed my cheek, and happily told me that Jason was an incredibly lucky man to be marrying me. A moment later, Sydney made her grand entrance. The entire room of bridesmaids went completely silent. She was wearing a floor-length form-fitting gown, covered in silver sequins that caught every ounce of light in the room. It featured a plunging neckline and a thigh-high slit. It was designed explicitly to upstage the bride, practically glowing a brilliant, blinding white under the country club chandeliers. She strutted across the suite, her hand resting delicately on her slightly rounded stomach, projecting an aura of absolute sickening smugness. She stopped behind my chair, meeting my eyes in the vanity mirror. She offered a fake sweet smile and asked if I was ready for the big night. I kept my expression perfectly serene and told her I had never been more ready for anything in my life. Sydney laughed, pouring herself a glass of sparkling cider. She leaned against the vanity and looked around the opulent room, making a show of inspecting the expensive floral arrangements. She said I was going to need my rest tonight. She took a sip of her cider and looked at me with a sharp, calculating glint in her eye. She casually mentioned that Jason has incredible stamina. She said he is the kind of man who goes all night and never gets tired, so I better be prepared to keep up with him. The bridesmaids giggled, thinking it was just a cheeky, sisterly joke. But Sydney and I both knew exactly what she meant. She was flaunting her affair right in my face, high on the thrill of her own secret, believing I was entirely oblivious to the fact that her stamina comment was based on her recent personal experience in her own bedroom. I smiled back at her. I told her I appreciated the advice, but I had a feeling tonight was going to be over a lot faster than anyone expects. Sydney smirked, completely missing the hidden warning. She spun around to show off the silver gown to my mother, asking if the sequins were too much for a daytime ceremony. My mother beamed, praising the dress and calling Sydney glowing. They were perfectly comfortable in their shared delusion, absolutely certain they had won. They thought I was walking into a lifelong trap, ready to hand over my financial future to a man already planning his life with my sister. I excused myself, claiming I needed a moment of quiet to read over my vows before putting on my dress. I walked into the adjoining private dressing room and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The sounds of laughing and clinking glasses faded into a dull murmur. I pulled my phone from my silk robe pocket. I opened my encrypted messaging app and typed a precise message to Elias, my wealth manager and attorney. I asked for confirmation on the final asset shift. Elias replied within 30 seconds. He confirmed that the $12 million had been completely locked down in an irrevocable offshore trust. Jason would not be able to touch a single penny, even if he managed to slip a ring on my finger. That was only the first part of the trap. The second part was the real masterpiece. For the past 2 years, my parents had been playing the role of wealthy benefactors, boasting to the entire country club that they were paying for this lavish event. I let them maintain that facade, but I was the one secretly writing the checks. However, yesterday afternoon, I had Elias exploit a loophole I intentionally buried in the fine print of the venue and catering contracts. I texted Elias to execute the liability transfer now. I watched the typing bubble appear on my screen. He replied that it was done. He had officially filed the paperwork transferring the ultimate financial liability for the $150,000 wedding bill to my father's failing real estate firm. Because my father had eagerly signed as the secondary guarantor to keep up appearances, the legal shift was seamless. The country club now held him responsible for every single dime. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. My assets were untouchable. My family was about to be buried under a mountain of debt they could not pay. I turned around and looked at my pristine wedding gown hanging in the corner. It was time to walk down the aisle and blow their world to pieces. The doors of the ballroom swung open, revealing a sea of white orchids. 300 guests sat in aligned gold chairs. On the right sat Jason's elite connections, wealthy partners, and old money families. On the left sat Terrence's medical family, a dignified row of esteemed surgeons. In the front row were my parents, William and Caroline, vibrating with pride. Sydney sat beside them, her silver dress an intentional beacon. The quartet struck the first chord of the bridal march. Everyone stood. I did not take my father's arm. I stepped into the aisle alone, feeling the silk of my gown brush the runner. The solo entrance sent confused whispers through the crowd, but my posture was absolute steel. My eyes locked onto the altar. Jason stood waiting, looking like a mannequin in his tailored tuxedo. He wore his signature charismatic smile. To me, he looked like a predator. His gaze met mine, and I saw calculated relief wash over his features. He thought his gambling debts were moments away from being erased by my accounts. I kept walking to the slow rhythm of the cellos. I glanced at Caroline. She dabbed a dry eye with a handkerchief, playing the matriarch. I looked at Sydney. She leaned forward, her hand resting over her stomach, a smirk playing on her lips. Then I looked at Terrence. He stood tall in the second row, his suit immaculate. Our eyes connected for a fraction of a second. The trap was primed. It was time to detonate. I reached the end of the aisle and stepped up onto the altar. Jason reached out his manicured hand to take mine, playing the adoring groom. I stopped. I did not raise my hand. I stood exactly 3 feet away from him, my arms resting at my sides. Jason's confident smile faltered, his outstretched hand hanging in the empty space between us. A heavy silence descended over the ballroom. The string quartet let their final note fade into nothingness. Faces stared at us, sensing the disruption. The officiant cleared his throat, unsure of how to proceed. Jason leaned in, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Madeline, take my hand." "What are you doing?" I did not look at him. Instead, I turned toward the back of the ballroom, finding the sound booth. I gave a single, sharp nod. Instantly, the lighting in the ballroom went pitch black. The sudden darkness triggered a wave of startled gasps. Above the altar, hidden motors hummed to life. 2 massive projector screens slowly descended from the ceiling. The whirring sound echoed over the confused murmurs of the guests. Jason stepped back, darting his eyes around the darkened room. My parents exchanged panicked looks in the front row, while Sydney's smirk completely vanished. The screens did not illuminate with smiling pictures. They remained solid black. But the surround sound system suddenly cracked to life. A faint rustle of clothing and the sound of rain hitting a window echoed through the massive speakers wrapping around the guests. Then Jason's voice boomed through the room, crystal clear and deafeningly loud. "Are you absolutely sure Terrence does not suspect anything?" The entire ballroom collectively inhaled. It was unmistakable. The groom's voice vibrated off the chandeliers. Jason physically recoiled at the altar, his eyes widening in sheer terror. He looked at me, then at the black screens, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Sydney's voice immediately followed, dripping with arrogant amusement. "Terrence is at the hospital pulling another double shift. He is completely clueless. He thinks this pregnancy is a miracle after we stopped trying last year." Horrifying chaos erupted in the front rows. Terrence's mother gasped, clutching her chest. The medical professionals turned their heads towards Sydney, their faces twisting in disgust. Sydney shrank back into her chair, her hands flying to cover her face as the truth of her infidelity echoed across the venue. My mother's voice sliced through the uproar. "You two need to be careful. The wedding is tomorrow. Jason, you just need to get Madeline down the aisle and sign that marriage certificate. Once you are legally tied to her, you will have access to her savings. Her credit is flawless. We can leverage her accounts to clear out your gambling debts before those bookies come collecting." Jason's conservative parents stood up. His father's face turned purple, recognizing his son's financial ruin being broadcast to his peers. Jason stood frozen, sweating profusely. Then my father's voice reverberated off the walls. "Exactly. Madeline is obedient and desperate for approval. She will not ask questions when you ask her to co-sign the business loans. Once we get the capital to save my real estate firm from bankruptcy, you and Sydney can figure out your living situation." The room descended into utter bedlam. The facade of my family's wealth was instantly pulverized. William sank into his chair, hiding his face, his business reputation completely annihilated. The final piece of audio played. It was Jason's voice trembling with cowardice. What about Terrence? His family has serious generational wealth. If he finds out the baby is mine, his lawyers will annihilate Sydney in the divorce. He will leave her with nothing. My mother's dismissive reply was the final nail in the coffin. Oh, do not worry about the good doctor. Sydney has already been documenting false claims of his temper. Next month, she is going to file a police report for domestic abuse. A trauma surgeon cannot survive an abuse charge. The hospital board will suspend his license immediately. We will force a quiet settlement to make the charges go away, and she keeps the luxury condo and gets permanent alimony. The audio ended with a sharp click. The lights in the ballroom slammed back on bright. The silence that followed was heavy, toxic, and lethal. 300 guests stared at the front row, and the altar paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal they had just witnessed. The execution was flawless. The silence shattered. A low murmur swelled into a deafening roar of shouts and furious accusations. The pristine ballroom transformed instantly into a chaotic arena of public disgrace. Jason took a desperate step forward, his hands trembling as he stared into the crowd searching for a lifeline. He found none. In the third row, his conservative old money parents rose in perfect, rigid unison. His mother's face was chalk white, her lips pressed into a thin line of horror. His father, a man whose reputation was built on strict moral superiority, looked at his son with unvarnished disgust. Jason scrambled down the altar steps, his polished facade obliterated. He reached out, begging his father to listen, pleading that the audio was somehow fabricated. His father simply raised a single commanding hand, silencing his son instantly. The patriarch did not yell. Without a backward glance or a single word spoken to the son who had just humiliated their lineage, Jason's parents turned and marched down the center aisle. Their elite friends and business partners immediately followed suit, creating a mass exodus of wealth and influence draining rapidly from the room. Jason fell to his knees on the carpet, clutching his hair, as his world vaporized before his eyes. He was completely alone now, facing the absolute wreckage of his own arrogant, pathetic choices. While Jason groveled, Terrence made his move. He stepped from the second row, his posture immaculate, his expression carved from stone. He walked with the measured pace of a surgeon. The crowd parted instinctively as he approached the front row. Sydney was hyperventilating in her silver dress, mascara running down her cheeks. When she saw Terrence, she launched into a desperate performance. She threw herself toward him, sobbing wildly, grasping his suit jacket. She cried that she was sorry, that Jason manipulated her, and that she loved him. Terrence did not flinch. He gently but firmly peeled her fingers off his lapel. From his inside pocket, he withdrew a pristine manila folder and held it out. Sydney stared at it, her fake sobs catching in her throat. Terrence spoke clearly, ensuring his voice carried to my paralyzed parents. He informed her the folder contained immediate divorce papers and a court-ordered prenatal paternity test mandate. Then he delivered the crushing blow. He told her she would find a 24-hour eviction notice for their luxury downtown condo. He calmly reminded her the property was solely in his name, purchased before their marriage. He advised her to have her bags packed by noon tomorrow because the locks were being changed. Sydney collapsed into her chair, letting out a guttural wail of despair as the folder dropped into her lap. Terrence adjusted his cuffs, turned his back on her, and walked steadily down the aisle. His prominent medical family stood in unison, forming a protective wall as they escorted him out. The grand ballroom was now half empty, echoing only with Sydney's pathetic sobs and Jason's defeated silence on the floor. That was when the initial shock finally wore off for my father. William's face turned an alarming, dangerous shade of crimson. The realization that his failing real estate business was now public knowledge broadcast loudly to every potential investor and bitter rival in the city ignited a furious, blinding rage within him. He stormed up the carpeted altar steps, his fists clenched tight at his sides, spit flying from his mouth as he completely ignored his crying favorite daughter. He focused absolutely all of his unhinged wrath on me. He screamed that I was an ungrateful, vindictive monster who had just permanently destroyed the pristine family name. He roared that I had intentionally humiliated them in front of the entire elite community they had spent decades trying to impress. He pointed a violently trembling finger inches from my face, shouting that I had selfishly wasted $150,000 on a wedding just to pull off a psychotic dramatic stunt. He demanded to know how I could ruthlessly throw away that kind of money when I knew their business was struggling to survive. I stood my ground perfectly. My posture remained absolutely straight, my expression completely serene and clinical. I waited patiently for his unhinged screaming to echo away into the cavernous ceiling above us. When he finally ran out of breath, panting heavily with his face flushed red, I smiled. I slowly reached behind the large imported floral arrangement resting on the officiant's podium and retrieved a sleek black leather binder I had hidden there earlier. I stepped forward and pressed the heavy binder firmly against his chest, forcing him to take it. I told him to open it and read the first page. William flipped the thick cover open, his eyes frantically scanning the top document. His jaw dropped open in sheer disbelief. I spoke loud enough for my mother, who was currently clutching her pearls in the front row, to hear every single syllable clearly. I explained that I had not wasted a single penny of my own money today. I calmly informed him that yesterday afternoon, my brilliant lawyer utilized a highly specific liability transfer clause hidden deep within the fine print of the venue and catering contracts. Because William had so eagerly signed as the secondary guarantor to pretend to his rich country club friends that he was entirely financing the event, the legal transfer was completely flawless. I told him the luxury country club rental, the premium open bar, the exotic orchids, and the 5-course plated dinner were no longer my financial responsibility. The contracts had been entirely shifted to his failing real estate limited liability company. I smiled sweetly and told him he was now holding the bag for a massive 6-figure bill payable immediately. William staggered backward in absolute shock, the heavy binder slipping from his grasp. Caroline shrieked loudly in the background. I lifted my gown and walked gracefully away, leaving them in absolute ruins. The heavy, polished glass doors of William and Caroline's downtown real estate office offered a brilliant, convincing illusion of massive success to anyone walking off the busy Chicago street. The massive reception area featured imported Italian marble floors, sleek leather couches, and an enormous mahogany desk. However, on this particular Monday morning, the luxurious facade barely masked the thick scent of absolute desperation. The multi-line phones on the receptionist's desk had been ringing incessantly since 8 o'clock. The receptionist had been dismissed for the day, leaving my parents entirely alone in the cavernous office space to face the incoming barrage. I was not there to witness their total meltdown, but Elias had painted a vivid, satisfying picture of the financial bloodbath. The Oakbrook Country Club billing department was angrily demanding immediate wire transfers. The florist, the caterer, and the string quartet were relentlessly threatening swift legal action over the unpaid invoices I had gracefully redirected to my father's business entity. William paced furiously behind the closed mahogany doors of his corner office. His usually pristine, expensive hair was wildly disheveled and his silk tie hung loosely around his neck. Caroline sat on the very edge of a plush velvet armchair nursing a massive migraine, her eyes severely bloodshot from 2 consecutive days of non-stop crying. They had spent the entire weekend desperately ignoring calls from their furious, humiliated country club friends. Now, the harsh reality of the enormous 6-figure wedding bill was physically suffocating them. William violently slammed his fist against his desk, declaring that they simply needed to liquidate some immediate funds to silence the angry vendors. He aggressively insisted they could quickly squash the noise, pay the furious country club, and spin a highly creative lie to salvage their crumbling social standing. He stubbornly believed he could easily fix the unmitigated disaster I had engineered. He hurriedly booted up his desktop computer, his hands shaking slightly as he urgently navigated to their primary corporate banking portal. He planned to draw heavily from the company's emergency credit lines, a massive reserve he usually bragged was practically limitless. He aggressively typed in his secure credentials and hit enter, eagerly waiting for the comforting green numbers to appear on the bright screen. Instead, a stark red banner instantly flashed across the wide monitor. Access absolutely denied. Corporate account suspended. William blinked rapidly, roughly rubbing his tired eyes, foolishly assuming he had just made a simple typing error. He quickly re-entered his long password, hitting the keyboard keys with frantic, terrified aggression. The exact same red banner immediately appeared, accompanied by a bold notification that all associated commercial credit lines had been permanently frozen, pending an immediate administrative review. Caroline stood up, her fragile voice trembling, as she frantically asked what was wrong. William blankly stared at the glowing screen, his breathing turning dangerously shallow. He frantically clicked through the alternative banking portals, desperately trying to access their secondary accounts, their platinum corporate credit cards, and their massive overdraft protection reserves. Every single avenue returned the exact same terrifying red message. The financial vault was completely sealed tight. For many years, my parents had treated me like a naive, socially awkward disappointment. They genuinely believed my job was answering phones at a basic IT help desk. They never bothered to understand my career or the massive cybersecurity firm I built. More importantly, they conveniently forgot a crucial piece of legal paperwork from 5 years ago. When their real estate firm first started showing dangerous signs of financial instability, they desperately needed a secondary guarantor to secure a massive commercial bridge loan. I had quietly co-signed the paperwork, linking my immaculate financial portfolio to their rapidly sinking ship. Because of my flawless credit score and substantial quiet wealth, the banks granted them premium interest rates and enormous credit limits. I was the silent, invisible pillar keeping their entire fraudulent empire standing. And on Friday afternoon, exactly 24 hours before the wedding, Elias had formally executed the strict legal clauses required to completely sever my name from all their corporate accounts. Without my flawless financial backing acting as strong collateral, their actual dismal credit rating was instantly exposed to the ruthless banking algorithms. William grabbed his desk phone, frantically dialing their senior loan officer at the bank. He did not get the chance to leave a voicemail. The phone rang sharply in his hand before he could finish dialing the number. He answered it, assuming it was just another angry wedding vendor. Instead, the stern voice of their corporate banker echoed coldly through the receiver. The banker did not offer the usual warm golfing buddy greetings. He coldly informed William that the bank's risk assessment division had been working over the weekend. He stated that the immediate withdrawal of their primary guarantor triggered an automatic default covenant buried in the terms of their massive commercial loans. The banker explained that William and Caroline's debt-to-income ratio was now deemed critically toxic. Caroline gripped the edge of William's desk, her knuckles turning white as she listened to the banker's harsh voice projecting through the loud speakerphone. The banker delivered the final fatal strike. He demanded immediate full repayment of their outstanding commercial loans, a sum that vastly exceeded the six-figure wedding bill they were already panicking over. He informed them that if the funds were not wired by the end of the business day, the bank would begin the process of seizing their assets, including the office building, their luxury vehicles, and their pristine suburban home. The call disconnected with a sharp, echoing click. The silence in the corner office was absolute, suffocating, and terrifying. William dropped the phone receiver, his legs giving out as he collapsed into his leather desk chair. Caroline buried her face in her hands, letting out a hollow, defeated sob. The carefully constructed facade of their elite wealth and prestigious country club status had completely shattered into millions of unsalvageable pieces. They were totally, utterly bankrupt. With their bank accounts frozen and their literal survival hanging by a thread, my family possessed only one remaining currency: their heavily curated social influence. Cornered animals fight with ferocity, and Caroline was a master of suburban warfare. By Tuesday morning, the frantic damage control mutated into a coordinated, vicious offensive. If they could not buy their way out of the disaster, they were going to lie their way through it. The battlefield shifted from the locked mahogany doors of his office to the brightly lit, fiercely judgmental arenas of Instagram, Facebook, and the exclusive Oakbrook Country Club private forums. They needed a scapegoat to survive the scandal, and they eagerly painted a massive target squarely on my back. Sydney fired the opening shot. At precisely 9 in the morning, she published a meticulously crafted fake tearful video to her thousands of followers. She sat on the edge of her bed wearing a modest oversized sweater, cradling her baby bump with trembling hands. Looking directly into the camera, she spun a masterful, completely fabricated tale of tragic sisterly jealousy. She openly wept, claiming that my severe, persistent mental health struggles had culminated in a terrifying, psychotic break on my wedding day. She alleged that I had spent months harboring a deep, toxic resentment over her unexpected pregnancy, culminating in a vicious desire to destroy her happiness. Her performance was a sickening display of weaponized vulnerability designed entirely to manipulate the deeply entrenched sympathies of our affluent social circle. Caroline immediately amplified the attack with a lengthy, impassioned post of her own cross posted to every local community group and socialite message board. She provided the supposed technical explanation for the horrifying audio that had echoed through the ballroom. According to my mother, the entire recording was a malicious, highly sophisticated artificial intelligence deepfake. She explicitly stated that I, leveraging my extensive background in the technology sector, had utilized voice cloning software to manufacture the illicit conversation. She painted a vivid picture of a deeply disturbed daughter who had tragically lost her grip on reality, begging the community for prayers and understanding during this difficult family crisis. She expertly wove a narrative of a loving family desperately trying to handle a medically unstable relative. The digital wildfire spread through the affluent Chicago suburbs with terrifying speed. By Wednesday afternoon, the Oakbrook Country Club was buzzing exclusively with the scandal. The women who regularly played tennis with Caroline and the men who golfed with William consumed the fabricated narrative. It offered them a clean, easily digestible explanation that protected the rigid social hierarchy they all worshipped. It was much easier for them to believe that the quiet, introverted information technology worker had simply lost her mind than to accept that two of their most prominent members were bankrupt, fraudulent monsters. The country club gossip mill churned out increasingly exaggerated versions of my supposed mental decline, completely absolving Jason, Sydney, and my parents of any actual wrongdoing. The social fallout hit my personal life like a rapid, suffocating avalanche. My phone lit up continuously, but not with messages of support. I watched in real time as the carefully cultivated illusion of my suburban friendships evaporated. Women I had known since childhood, people I had hosted for dinner and celebrated holidays with, began aggressively severing ties. I was blocked on social media platforms by the dozens. The bridesmaids who had stood beside me in the suite just days prior sent lengthy, venomous text messages accusing me of being a cruel, vindictive psychopath before blocking my number. My social circle collapsed inward instantly, dividing the elite community into heavily guarded factions. The silence from the people I had trusted was profoundly deafening. I sat on the velvet sofa in my living room watching the follower count on my private accounts plummet. It was a brutal, incredibly efficient social cleansing. The people who eagerly bought into the malicious lies told by my mother demonstrated true colors without hesitation. They did not reach out to ask for my side of the story. They did not request any clarification. They simply consumed the dramatic, highly polished deception because it fed their insatiable appetite for scandalous entertainment. Every blocked contact, every deleted picture, and every hateful direct message served as a perfect filtration system, instantly removing the superficial parasites from my life. I felt a strange, cold sense of relief as the suburban deadweight eagerly detached itself from my existence. My public relations team and my attorneys strongly advised me to immediately release a counterstatement. They had drafted a concise, legally airtight press release, explicitly denying the artificial intelligence allegations and gently hinting at the underlying financial truths. They wanted to kill the rumors before they metastasized further. I firmly ordered them to stand down. I explicitly commanded my entire team to maintain absolute total silence. I did not post a single defensive response. I did not upload any counter evidence. I completely deactivated my public social media presence and allowed the toxic wave of digital abuse to wash over me without raising a single shield. I became a total ghost, refusing to feed the insatiable machine of public gossip with any reaction whatsoever. My silence was not a surrender, it was a highly calculated lethal strategy. Every time Caroline posted another defamatory claim about my mental state, she dug her legal grave deeper. Every time Sydney typed a vicious lie about the audio being a manufactured deepfake, she documented her guilt. They confused my lack of public response for weakness, assuming their aggressive smear campaign had bullied me into submission. They were blinded by their desperate need to control the immediate social narrative. They forgot that publishing malicious, provably false statements designed to ruin a professional reputation constitutes severe defamation. Furthermore, repeatedly lying in written forums while under investigation for financial fraud is a serious crime. I sat back and watched them document their destruction, knowing well that perjury in writing carries a mandatory prison sentence. The fluorescent lights of the local police precinct cast a harsh and unforgiving glare across the scuffed linoleum floor. Sydney sat perfectly still on the hard wooden bench, letting the severe chill of the room seep deep into her bones. She needed to look the part. She needed to look entirely shattered. With practiced precision, she adjusted the collar of her oversized knit sweater, ensuring the dark and mottled bruising on her collarbone remained partially obscured but entirely visible to any trained eye. She had spent 40 arduous minutes in front of her bathroom mirror that very morning, repeatedly driving her own knuckles into her skin, meticulously mapping out the precise geometry of a manufactured assault. The physical pain had been sharp, but her sheer desperation for cash fueled her unwavering resolve. The backup plan she had so casually outlined on that hidden tape was no longer a mere theory. It was her only remaining lifeline. When the desk sergeant finally called her name, Sydney forced her shoulders to slump dramatically. She walked toward the front desk with a calculated limp, wrapping her arms tightly around her torso as a protective shield against an invisible threat. The officer stationed behind the reinforced glass took one single look at her battered appearance and immediately signaled for a private interview room. Once seated securely across from a seasoned detective, Sydney unleashed the performance of a lifetime. Tears flowed freely, hot and remarkably credible, as she recounted a fabricated night of absolute terror. She described Terence with chilling specificity, painting the highly respected doctor as a volatile monster who finally snapped under the immense pressure of their failing relationship. She detailed the imaginary argument, the sudden explosion of violence, and her desperate escape into the cold night. To cement the lie, she handed over her phone showing the authorities carefully staged text messages she had sent from her own secondary burner phone, creating a flawless and terrifying digital trail of fear. The detective listened with profound and sympathetic outrage. Sydney knew exactly which legal buttons to press to guarantee an immediate response. She expressed absolute terror for her immediate physical safety and her precarious financial security, tearfully claiming that Terence had threatened to cut off her access to their joint medical accounts if she ever dared to speak out about the abuse. The precinct swung into motion with terrifying efficiency. Within the hour, an emergency judge had reviewed the compelling evidence and signed an emergency ex parte restraining order. The legal paperwork granted Sydney immediate and exclusive access to the disputed medical accounts to ensure she could secure safe housing and urgent medical care away from her supposed abuser. She walked out of the precinct with a signed piece of paper that was essentially a blank check, her tears drying the exact second the heavy glass doors closed behind her. The first domino had fallen exactly as she planned. Across town, the sterile and highly controlled environment of the hospital offered Terence a false sanctuary. He was halfway through a complex patient consultation, burying his mounting personal anxieties in the familiar and comforting rhythm of medical charts and precise diagnoses. The antiseptic smell of the clinical corridors usually grounded his thoughts, but today it provided no real comfort. He had just finished explaining a detailed post-operative care plan when the heavy double doors of the ward swung open violently. Two uniformed police officers stepped directly into the bustling corridor, their commanding presence immediately silencing the usual chaotic hum of the active nursing station. Terence looked up from his clipboard, a sudden and painful knot tightening in his stomach as the officers made a direct line toward him. They did not care about the audience. They did not care about the whispering nurses, the staring orderlies, or the bewildered patients watching the scene unfold. The taller officer stepped forward, a thick manila folder held securely in his right hand. He asked Terence to confirm his identity, his stern voice carrying clearly down the quiet hallway for everyone to hear. When Terence nodded, entirely confused and caught off guard, the officer handed him the thick stack of legal documents. The harsh black words on the white paper swam before Terence's eyes. The officer loudly and publicly explained the severe parameters of the court order, instructing the doctor that he was legally barred from returning to his own home, contacting Sydney in any capacity, or accessing the primary medical funds that kept his private practice afloat. Terence felt the blood drain completely from his face, leaving him pale and dizzy. He tried to speak, to explain desperately that there had been a massive and catastrophic mistake, but the officers held up a firm hand to silence him. They informed him that the hospital administration was already being formally notified of the ongoing domestic violence investigation. The invisible threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A domestic violence charge would trigger an automatic and immediate review by the state medical board. His license, his flawless reputation, and the prestigious career he had spent over a decade building were suddenly teetering on the verge of total collapse. The officers escorted him out of the busy ward, forcing him into a humiliating perp walk in front of the very colleagues he led and the vulnerable patients he treated. He was ordered to clear his personal items from his locker and vacate the hospital premises immediately, pending the administration's internal review. Standing alone in the freezing hospital parking lot, stripped of his medical authority and locked out of his own life, blind panic finally consumed him. His hands shook so violently, he dropped his car keys twice on the asphalt before managing to unlock the driver's side door. He scrambled inside the vehicle, slamming the heavy door to shut out the curious stares of passing staff members heading to their shifts. He grabbed his cell phone and frantically dialed the only person who could possibly comprehend the sheer magnitude of this unprecedented disaster. Madeline answered on the second ring, her voice crisp, confident, and businesslike, completely unaware that the solid ground beneath their family had just collapsed into a sinkhole. Terence could barely form coherent sentences as he tried to explain the nightmare. He stumbled over his own words, his voice cracking and breaking as he described the arrival of the police. The fabricated bruises Sydney must have presented, the binding restraining order, and the entirely frozen medical accounts. He told Madeline that Sydney had flawlessly executed the exact backup plan she had recorded on the tape, weaponizing the local legal system against them with a terrifying and ruthless speed. Madeline fell dead silent on the other end of the line, the gravity of the situation paralyzing her vocal cords. For days, their entire family had operated under the arrogant assumption that they held the absolute upper hand. They firmly believed that uncovering the secret tape had permanently neutralized Sydney, that they had successfully cornered the schemer and decisively won the initial skirmish. They had quietly celebrated their presumed victory, incredibly confident that Sydney was entirely out of viable options and rapidly running out of time. That false sense of security shattered into a million jagged and irreparable pieces. Madeline instantly realized the devastating brilliance of Sydney's desperate maneuver. Sydney had never intended to retreat or surrender. She had simply flipped the entire board. By striking directly at Terence's medical license and seizing the vital financial assets under the impenetrable guise of being a battered victim, she had immobilized the family's primary earner and weaponized public sympathy to serve her agenda. The family had completely and fatally underestimated her raw desperation and her vast capacity for unmitigated ruthlessness. Terence gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white, listening helplessly to Madeline's rapid, panicked breathing over the phone line. The war they smugly thought they were winning had only just begun, and Sydney had just launched a devastating, calculated first strike that left them entirely defenseless and reeling in shock. The line went dead, leaving Madeline in the silence of her home office. Terrence was holed up in a hotel, his life hanging by a thread. The audacity of Sydney's move ignited a cold fury in Madeline's chest. The panic gripping her brother triggered a lethal calm. She turned toward her workstation. This high-tech command center glowed with the blue light of 4 curved displays backed by humming servers stacked in the corner. Sydney thought she could use the legal system to destroy them. She forgot who built her digital walls. Madeline cracked her knuckles, hovering over the mechanical keyboard. A razor-sharp memory sliced through her anger. A year ago, Sydney complained about package thefts. Terrence asked Madeline for a favor, and she spent a Saturday wiring their house with an integrated smart home security network. She meticulously installed cameras, configured motion sensors, and set up encrypted cloud storage. Sydney had been thrilled with the 4K resolution. She was unaware that Madeline, the network architect, retained administrative access privileges deep within the system architecture for maintenance purposes. Her fingers flew across the keys, effortlessly bypassing the standard user interface. She had built the digital backdoor herself. Within seconds, lines of code gave way to the familiar back-end portal of the cloud storage server. The digital footprint of the house lay bare before her. Madeline filtered the massive data logs, narrowing her search to the interior cameras over the last 48 hours. She zeroed in on the primary hallway camera, a wide-angle lens positioned to capture the master bedroom door, the main staircase, and the adjoining bathroom. The progress bar filled rapidly as the 4K video files downloaded directly to her secure local server. She opened the media player, scrubbing through hours of mundane footage. She watched Terrence leaving for the hospital early that morning, his posture heavy with exhaustion. The house sat empty and quiet for a long stretch. Then the high-sensitivity motion sensor triggered a new recording. The timestamp matched the exact hour before Sydney walked into the local police precinct. Madeline slowed the playback to real-time, eyes locked on the monitor. Sydney stepped out of the master bathroom, dressed in the oversized knit sweater she would later wear to play the traumatized victim. She was entirely alone. Madeline held her breath, leaning closer to the glowing screen. The high-definition footage captured every movement with agonizing clarity. Sydney paused in the hallway, looking around to ensure she was unseen. Then, with a chilling lack of hesitation, she squared her shoulders, took a sharp step back, and drove her right arm and collarbone directly into the solid wooden doorframe. Madeline watched the video, repulsed by the calculation on display. Sydney bounced off the wood, wincing slightly, then examined her arm. Not satisfied with the initial damage, she repeated the violent motion, slamming herself into the sharp edge a second time with greater force. The bruising would be immediate and severe. What happened next was the ultimate nail in the coffin. Sydney pulled her cell phone from her pocket and dialed a number. The integrated audio feed picked up her voice. She was talking to Caroline. As Sydney inspected her newly manufactured injuries, a loud, genuine laugh echoed down the hallway. She bragged to Caroline about the dark bruises forming on her skin, boasting about how easily the police would buy her story. The performance was nauseatingly clear. It was a calculated, self-inflicted assault designed to ruin an innocent man. Madeline clipped the video segment, enhanced the audio track for absolute clarity, and saved encrypted backups across 3 offline drives. She grabbed her flash drive and dialed Elias as she sprinted toward her car. When Elias answered, she commanded him to meet her downtown immediately. They were not going back to the local precinct. The desk officers there had already bought Sydney's fake tears. They needed to bypass the lower levels of the justice system entirely and bring their digital guillotine directly to the top of the food chain. 30 minutes later, Madeline and Elias marched through the imposing marble lobby of the county courthouse, demanding an urgent audience with the district attorney. Elias utilized his extensive legal leverage, calling in favors to bypass bureaucratic delays. They were ushered into a wood-paneled conference room where the district attorney, a stern woman with zero tolerance for legal games, sat waiting. She looked annoyed by the interruption, pointing out that an emergency ex parte order was a standard judicial procedure. Madeline did not argue. She simply placed her sleek laptop on the polished mahogany table, inserted the flash drive, and turned the high-resolution screen directly toward the powerful prosecutor. She hit play. The room instantly fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The 4K video filled the screen, displaying Sydney's violent, self-inflicted blows against the doorframe. The crisp audio of her laughing on the phone with Caroline echoed off the conference room walls, exposing the malicious scheme in undeniable detail. The district attorney watched the footage twice, the annoyance on her face hardening into a profound, righteous anger. The legal system had been weaponized. The reversal was instantaneous and brutal. The district attorney grabbed her desk phone, issuing rapid-fire orders to her staff. The emergency restraining order against Terrence was vacated on the spot. The devastating freeze on the medical accounts was lifted. Terrence was completely cleared, his prestigious career permanently shielded by the undeniable digital truth. By lying to a police officer, staging physical injuries, and swearing under oath to a fabricated sequence of events, Sydney crossed a massive, unforgivable legal line. The district attorney signed the warrants right then and there. The hunter had instantly become the hunted. Sydney was no longer an untouchable mastermind holding the entire family hostage. She was a criminal suspect currently facing immediate arrest for felony perjury and the deliberate filing of a false police report. The trap she had so carefully laid for Terrence had just snapped shut on her own neck. Madeline closed her laptop with a satisfying click. While the trap violently closed around Sydney in her empty hallway, Jason sat comfortably in his corner office overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline, completely oblivious to the impending storm. He genuinely believed he had successfully escaped the blast radius of the collapsing scheme. Sydney was the one who had her fingerprints all over the extorted funds and the fabricated police reports. Jason had operated strictly in the shadows, keeping his hands ostensibly clean while manipulating the players from afar. He reclined in his plush leather chair, sipping a meticulously brewed espresso, projecting the aura of a man who had already conquered the financial world. Beneath that tailored Italian suit and polished veneer, however, a profound desperation churned. Jason owed a staggering sum to offshore gambling syndicates, a dangerous secret that threatened to dismantle his carefully curated life if left unpaid. His entire survival strategy hinged on securing an imminent promotion to senior partner at the prestigious corporate financial firm. The partnership came with a massive signing bonus and profit-sharing percentages that would instantly erase his illicit debts and permanently secure his elite status. To guarantee his elevation, Jason had spent the last 3 months aggressively leveraging his industry connections, banking his entire future on a massive portfolio upgrade. His crown jewel was an exclusive asset management contract with the largest private hospital network in the Midwest. It was a multi-million-dollar account that he had personally courted and was poised to finalize by the end of the fiscal quarter. He checked his gold. Rolex smiled at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass and confidently strode out of his office, convinced the morning meeting request from Human Resources was the official confirmation of his partnership. Jason walked into the glass-walled conference room with a triumphant smirk, fully expecting champagne and congratulatory handshakes. Instead, he found the firm's global managing partner sitting stiffly beside the grim-faced director of Human Resources. 2 thick, sealed manila folders rested ominously on the mahogany table between them. The triumphant smirk vanished from Jason's face, instantly replaced by a creeping dread. The managing partner did not offer a seat. He simply slid the top folder across the polished wood. The hospital network had just submitted an immediate and catastrophic termination of all current and pending asset management contracts with the firm. The cancellation was not due to poor market performance or competitive rates. It was a direct, targeted execution triggered by a specific board member invoking a severe moral turpitude clause. That board member was Terrence's father. The patriarch of the family had unleashed his own devastating strike, mobilizing his vast corporate influence to eradicate the man who had conspired to destroy his son. The hospital network's legal department had provided the firm with undeniable proof of Jason's unethical financial maneuvers, citing massive conflicts of interest and off-book liabilities that violated strict regulatory compliance. The managing partner's voice was devoid of any sympathy as he informed Jason that the firm was not merely terminating his employment effectively immediately, but they were also legally obligated to report his severe regulatory breaches to the National Financial Oversight Commission. In the span of a 3-minute meeting, Jason lost his job, his promised bonus, and his licenses. He was completely and irrevocably blacklisted from the corporate financial sector. Security officers materialized at the conference room door, instructed to escort him directly to the freight elevator without allowing him to return to his corner office. Stripped of his career, his elite status, and his primary income stream, the crushing reality of his gambling debts crashed down upon him. The syndicates did not care about human resources decisions or regulatory blacklists. They only cared about cash, and Jason was now entirely devoid of capital. Panic, raw and unadulterated, consumed him as he stumbled out onto the busy Chicago streets, holding a cardboard box of personal desk items. His survival instincts kicked into overdrive, leading him to the only person he believed could still offer a viable lifeline. Hours later, a frantic pounding echoed through Madeline's apartment. She checked her security monitor, unsurprised to find a disheveled and desperate Jason standing in the hallway. His expensive suit jacket was wrinkled, his tie hung loosely around his neck, and the arrogant confidence that usually defined him had completely evaporated. Madeline opened the heavy oak door just wide enough to lean against the frame, holding her smartphone casually in her left hand. Jason did not wait for an invitation. He immediately launched into a pathetic, rambling monologue, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He begged Madeline for forgiveness, pleading with her to use her financial resources to help him cover his debts. To save his own skin, he ruthlessly threw his co-conspirator under the bus. He swore frantically that the entire extortion scheme had been Sydney's exclusive design. He painted himself as an innocent victim, whining that Sydney had aggressively seduced him and manipulated his vulnerabilities to weaponize his financial knowledge. He claimed he had tried to stop her, that he had always loved Madeline, and that he had only participated out of a misguided fear of Sydney's volatile retaliation. The groveling was spectacularly undignified. Jason fell to his knees in the hallway, clutching the edge of Madeline's doorframe, sobbing as he begged for a second chance and a financial bailout. Madeline looked down at the ruined man, her expression carved from ice. She felt absolutely no pity. She shifted her weight, ensuring the camera lens of her smartphone captured every second of his sniveling betrayal. She recorded the entire display, capturing his explicit admissions and his desperate attempts to blame his partner in crime. When Jason finally ran out of breath, Madeline offered a terrifyingly serene smile. She tapped the dark screen, ending the high-definition recording. With 2 swift motions, she sent the video file directly to Sydney's personal email. Jason watched her finger tap the send icon, a profound horror dawning in his eyes. The heavy oak door clicked shut, severing Jason's desperate pleas and leaving him entirely alone in the sterile apartment hallway. Madeline did not spare him a second thought. While the disgraced advisor faced the wrath of the syndicates, a completely different breed of desperation was festering across the city. William and Caroline, seething with a toxic mixture of embarrassment and entitlement, sat rigid in the cracked leather chairs of a profoundly dingy downtown office. The room smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke and cheap cologne, a fitting ambiance for the legal representation they had chosen. Arthur Vance was not a lawyer who concerned himself with ethics or justice. He was a parasite, a legal predator who thrived on exploiting familial fractures and extracting settlements through sheer nuisance. William and Caroline had sought him out specifically for his ruthless reputation, bypassing respectable firms that would have laughed their frivolous grievances out the door. They wanted vengeance. The spectacular collapse of the recent events had publicly humiliated them, and they blamed their daughter entirely for the resulting social fallout. They were determined to make Madeline pay for their manufactured suffering and profound embarrassment. Caroline dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, performing the role of the devastated matriarch with practiced ease. She spun a tragic tale of severe emotional distress, lamenting the shattered family reputation and the exorbitant costs associated with the canceled wedding festivities. She demanded full financial restitution, insisting that Madeline's cruel and unyielding boundaries had caused them irreparable psychological harm. William nodded firmly in agreement, adopting the posture of a stern but deeply wounded patriarch. They wanted Arthur to draft a massive lawsuit aiming to drain whatever meager savings they assumed their estranged daughter possessed. Arthur listened to their tearful performance with an expression of profound boredom. He steepled his fingers, waiting for the theatrical display to conclude before interjecting with cold, hard reality. He informed them that emotional distress cases derived from family squabbles were notoriously difficult to win, and the court would likely dismiss the wedding expense claims as voluntary contributions. The sleazy attorney bluntly stated that he did not work on contingency for frivolous emotional grievances unless there was a guaranteed massive payout waiting at the finish line. He needed concrete assets to target not just their wounded, fragile pride. To determine if the lawsuit was even worth his billable hours, Arthur had taken the liberty of running a preliminary, albeit highly questionable, asset discovery check on Madeline. He utilized a network of shady private investigators and illicit financial databases to bypass standard privacy protections. William scoffed at the effort, assuring the lawyer that Madeline was just a standard network architect living comfortably, but modestly. Caroline added that their daughter had always been frugal, hoarding her average salary instead of investing in the family's social elevation. They expected Arthur to uncover a standard checking account and perhaps a small retirement fund. Arthur ignored their dismissive assumptions. He reached into his battered briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder, tossing it onto the center of the scratched glass desk. He advised them to look closely at the highlighted figures on the second page. William leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses with an irritated sigh while Caroline peered over his shoulder. The document was a highly restricted bank summary from an offshore holding account directly tied to Madeline's primary domestic limited liability company. The financial jargon blurred together until William's eyes locked onto a single, deeply highlighted line item near the bottom margin. The breath caught violently in William's throat. He pulled the paper closer, his hands suddenly trembling as he counted the numerous zeros. The document detailed a massive lump sum wire transfer executed less than 8 months ago. Madeline had not merely been setting up smart home security networks or managing corporate firewalls. She had developed and silently sold an incredibly advanced proprietary cybersecurity encryption patent to a global tech conglomerate. The verified sale price was an astronomical $12 million. The sheer magnitude of the hidden wealth sat there in black and white, mocking their lifelong underestimation of her quiet capabilities. The suffocating silence in the dingy office was deafening. Caroline snatched the paper from her husband's trembling hands, her eyes scanning the certified banking seals and the massive 8-figure balance. The heavy, oppressive mask of the grieving, victimized mother vanished in an absolute instant. The manufactured tears evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity that sharpened her features. The devastating embarrassment of the ruined wedding and the sting of social humiliation were utterly forgotten, instantly eclipsed by a blinding, rabid surge of unadulterated greed. $12 million was not just staggering wealth. It was a total, irreversible paradigm shift. William's posture shifted from wounded patriarch to an aggressive, demanding claimant. He slammed his fist onto the armrest of his leather chair, the old material groaning under the sudden force. He vehemently declared that they had been utterly deceived, furious that their daughter had hoarded this vast fortune while allowing her own parents to shoulder mundane financial burdens. Caroline immediately echoed his outrage, her voice shrill with sudden, overwhelming entitlement. They rapidly constructed a new narrative, convincing themselves within seconds that Madeline's success was entirely due to their parental sacrifices. The money, they decided, fundamentally belonged to the family unit. They aggressively rationalized their ravenous greed, loudly claiming they had housed her, fed her, and financed her early education. In their newly warped reality, the $12 million was merely a delayed return on their significant parental investment. Arthur watched the miraculous transformation with a predatory grin, finally seeing the lucrative angle he desperately required. The frivolous emotional distress lawsuit was instantly scrapped. The new strategy was a hostile financial siege. William and Caroline authorized Arthur to unleash a barrage of aggressive legal maneuvers determined to drag Madeline into a grueling court battle and bleed her dry until she ultimately surrendered exactly what they firmly believed was entirely rightfully theirs. The morning air in this high-end coffee shop was thick with the scent of roasted beans and the hushed murmurs of the morning rush. Madeline sat at a secluded table in the corner, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug of dark espresso. She had not come here seeking reconciliation, but she had agreed to the meeting a final opportunity for her parents to walk away with their dignity intact. William and Caroline arrived with an air of practiced solemnity that didn't quite mask the underlying desperation in their sharp, searching eyes. They did not sit down immediately. Instead, they stood over her like two vultures, circling a dying prey, their faces etched with a calculated blend of feigned disappointment and cold, predatory intent. Caroline was the first to speak, her voice low and tight, vibrating with an unsettling manufactured urgency. She spoke of the family's deep-seated shame, conveniently forgetting the decades of neglect she had presided over, and suggested that Madeline owed them a massive debt for the childhood she was so generously provided. Madeline didn't flinch. She took a slow, measured sip of her espresso, her gaze unwavering, as she watched her mother's mask begin to slip. The pretense of maternal concern vanished, replaced by the naked, ugly reality of extortion. William pulled out his chair and sat, his movements heavy and deliberate. He lowered his voice, dropping the facade of a wounded father. He claimed they had acquired a set of highly sensitive medical records, detailing a period in Madeline's teenage years when she had suffered from a bout of severe, debilitating depression. He framed these records as a ticking time bomb, a weapon they were fully prepared to detonate in the public square. They threatened to leak every single detail of her past struggles to the most prominent tech media outlets, weaponizing the cruel and judgmental culture of the industry against her. They argued that any founder with a history of mental health struggles would be deemed unstable by venture capitalists, effectively destroying the reputation she had spent years carefully constructing. The air in the shop seemed to grow thinner as they laid out their ultimatum. They demanded $5 million immediately, framing the exorbitant sum as a mandatory contribution to save the family. They wrapped the demand in the tattered shroud of filial duty, suggesting that as their daughter, it was her sacred obligation to ensure their comfort, regardless of the personal cost to her own stability. They spoke with the frantic conviction of the greedy, genuinely believing that the weight of her past would crush her into submission. They painted themselves as protectors of the family name, and her as the ungrateful, wealthy child who could easily afford to be bled dry. It was a classic low-stakes gamble, based on the assumption that Madeline would prioritize her pristine public image above all else. They waited breathlessly for the panic to set in, for her to start negotiating, for the first cracks of fear to appear on her face. Madeline remained perfectly still. Her movements were fluid and composed as she finished the last drop of her espresso, setting the cup down on the saucer with a soft, final click. The silence stretched between them, becoming heavier with every passing second. She reached into her leather handbag and withdrew a single, heavy-stock manila document, sliding it across the table until it rested directly under William's trembling hands. The paper was clean, crisp, and bore the unmistakable stamp of a federal notary. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was light and cheerful, a jarring contrast to the grim tension hanging over the table. She invited them to read the fine print, her eyes sparkling with a dark, dangerous amusement that made Caroline instinctively lean back in her seat. The document was not a check. It was a comprehensive, legally binding, and fully executed non-disclosure and litigation waiver agreement that they had unknowingly signed during their previous meeting at the lawyer's office. Cleverly disguised within the mountain of paperwork Arthur Vance had carelessly shoved in front of them. The fine print didn't just waive their rights to further litigation. It included a massive ironclad clawback clause for any attempt at extortion or blackmail. Furthermore, the document specified that any public disclosure of her medical history, past or present, would constitute an immediate and irreparable breach, triggering a mandatory forfeiture of every single asset they owned, including the house they were desperately fighting to save from foreclosure. William's eyes scanned the clauses, his complexion turning a sickly mottled gray. Caroline reached for the paper, her fingers fumbling, but she dropped it as if it were burning hot once she processed the implications. The leverage they thought they possessed had vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization that they had just signed their own financial death warrant. Madeline's smile didn't reach her eyes. She leaned forward, the shadows of the coffee shop casting her features in a sharp, intimidating relief. She calmly explained that the document was already filed with the court and that any attempt to carry out their threat would be met with an immediate permanent seizure of their remaining assets. She had anticipated their greed had factored their predictable patterns into her long-term strategy and had outmaneuvered them at every single turn. The parents realized then that the daughter they once looked down upon was not a victim to be exploited, but a formidable opponent who had mastered the very games they taught her. Their entire strategy, the threats, the extortion, the leverage, was nothing more than a house of cards, easily blown away by her superior preparation. Madeline stood up smooth and unbothered, while William and Caroline sat paralyzed in their chairs. The power dynamic in the room had shifted permanently and undeniably. She didn't offer a farewell, only a curt, cold nod, before turning and walking out of the cafe, leaving them in the wreckage of their own failed gamble. The coffee shop's door chimed as she exited, a final crisp sound that signaled the end of their influence over her life. They remained seated, the manila folder left on the table like a tombstone, staring into the abyss of a future they had just ensured would be significantly bleaker than they ever dared to imagine. The game was finished, and for the first time in their lives, they were forced to understand the price of their hubris. William's eyes darted across the legal paper. The document Madeline slid across the surface was far more devastating than a mere non-disclosure agreement. Flipping to the second page, the stark reality materialized in bold print. It was a comprehensive civil lawsuit drafted with lethal precision. Caroline snatched the paper from his trembling grip, her facade of wounded entitlement evaporating as her gaze fell upon the detailed financial ledger attached to the brief. Madeline remained perfectly still, her serene posture a stark contrast to the escalating panic radiating from her parents. She had not left the cafe. She merely shifted her chair back, waiting for this moment of horrifying comprehension to wash over them. Madeline's voice cut through the ambient noise of grinding espresso machines. She explained she hired a team of forensic accountants 8 months ago, long before Sydney's latest schemes began. Her initial goal was to consolidate her childhood financial records for a routine background check required by her tech company's board. Instead, the auditors unearthed a staggering trail of deceit. When Madeline turned 18, she was supposed to inherit a dedicated trust fund established by her late paternal grandfather, designated to cover college tuition and living expenses. That money never materialized. At the time, William and Caroline had solemnly informed her the market crashed, wiping out the investments entirely. They spun a tragic tale of ruin, forcing Madeline to take out predatory student loans and work 3 grueling jobs to survive. The forensic accountants followed the paper trail and discovered the absolute truth. The market never crashed. The investments matured perfectly. Instead, William and Caroline systematically drained the account, forging Madeline's signature on the primary release forms. They embezzled exactly $400,000 of her inheritance. Madeline leaned across the table, her dark eyes locking onto her mother's pale face. She listed exactly where the stolen funds had gone. The money paid for Sydney's exorbitant out-of-state tuition luxury, European backpacking trips, the down payment on her first sports car, and the designer wardrobe she flaunted throughout her 20s. William and Caroline had literally stolen Madeline's future to finance Sydney's extravagant, unearned lifestyle. Caroline gasped out loud, dropping the lawsuit onto the table as if the paper were toxic. She tried to formulate a defense, stammering about parental rights and the sheer cost of raising 2 daughters, but the lies died in her throat. Madeline did not raise her voice or change her posture. She simply tapped the document with one manicured fingernail and informed them the meeting was officially over. She gave them exactly 2 hours to present themselves at her attorney's downtown office, or she would hand the forensic audit directly to the federal authorities. Madeline stood up, adjusted her winter coat, and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her parents sitting in paralyzed silence. The transition from the bustling neighborhood cafe to Elias's sleek downtown law office felt like stepping into a refrigerated vault. The space was intimidating by design, featuring soundproof glass walls, polished concrete floors, and a massive slate conference table. When William and Caroline arrived, they looked visibly diminished. Their arrogant bluster was entirely stripped away, replaced by the shuffling gait of two people walking toward the gallows. Elias sat at the head of the table, flanked by two junior partners. Madeline sat to his right, her expression unreadable. She did not offer a greeting or a glass of water. She merely gestured for them to sit. Elias opened a thick binder, the snapping rings echoing loudly in the quiet room. He wasted no time on pleasantries, clearly laying out the criminal jeopardy they were facing. Extortion was a felony. Blackmail was a felony. Wire fraud, forgery, and the embezzlement of a protected trust fund were federal offenses carrying mandatory minimum sentences. Elias slid a printed transcript of their coffee shop conversation across the slate table. He informed them the entire extortion attempt, including the demand for $5 million and the threat to leak Madeline's sensitive medical records, had been legally recorded by a private investigator sitting 2 tables away. They had handed the prosecution a perfect, airtight confession on a silver platter. William began to sweat profusely, his hands shaking as he read the transcript of his own damning words. Caroline openly wept, begging Elias to consider their age and failing health. She pleaded with Madeline, invoking the sacred bond of family and desperately asking for mercy. Madeline remained utterly impassive. She calmly stated they forfeited the right to invoke family loyalty the moment they decided to steal her inheritance and weaponize her teenage depression for financial gain. Elias then presented the ultimatum. The checkmate was absolute. He placed a stack of finalized legal contracts in the center of the table. The first document was an ironclad permanent non-disclosure agreement. It legally barred William and Caroline from ever discussing Madeline, her medical history, her finances, or her business ventures with anyone under penalty of total financial ruin. The second document was a transfer of deed and equity. To repay the $400,000 they embezzled, plus a decade of compound interest and punitive damages, they were required to immediately sign over all remaining equity in their boutique logistics business directly to Madeline's holding company. William balked, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He shouted the business was his entire life's work, the only asset left to fund their retirement. Madeline stared him down with chilling apathy. She gave him a stark binary choice. He could sign the documents, surrender the business, and walk away with his freedom, or he could refuse, and she would instruct Elias to forward the entire dossier to the federal prosecutor's office before sunset. They would lose the business to legal fees anyway and spend their twilight years in a federal penitentiary. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The reality of their total defeat washed over them. With trembling hands and shattered pride, William picked up the heavy brass pen. The heavy brass pen had slipped from William's trembling fingers exactly 3 days prior, forcing this confrontation into the sterile, freezing confines of a downtown deposition room. Harsh fluorescent lighting cast a sickly pallor over the gray walls and scarred laminate table. A digital camera blinked with a crimson light, capturing every bead of sweat. Beside it, a silent court reporter typed with mechanical precision, turning their downfall into public record. Madeline sat rigidly beside Elias, projecting the immovable calm of a judge presiding over a tribunal. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her posture impeccable, watching her parents shrink under the oppressive weight of the ongoing legal siege. Elias did not raise his voice. He operated with the surgical precision of a butcher. Formal legal combat commenced the second the oath was administered. He systematically dismantled William first, laying out a labyrinthine paper trail that exposed decades of financial deceit. He produced bank statements, forged tax returns, and fraudulent wire transfers binding them into neat bundles labeled as exhibits. William attempted to fall back on his usual aggressive bluster, offering vague, convoluted explanations about market fluctuations and complex portfolio rebalancing. Elias slid Exhibit D across the table. A certified communication from the original trust executor proved the investments had yielded a 12% return the year William claimed they had evaporated. The patriarch's arrogant facade disintegrated instantly, leaving behind a stuttering, cornered man who could not string together a coherent sentence under the searing glare of the camera lens. The interrogation swung toward Caroline, who had spent the first hour staring at the table. Elias traced the flow of the stolen funds from the domestic holding accounts into Caroline's personal checking. He forced her to verbally confirm her signature on the illicit withdrawal slips. Every single lie she had ever told her daughter about their supposed financial hardships was brutally picked apart, laid bare against the stark reality of the ledger. Caroline squirmed in her uncomfortable chair, her manicured nails digging deep into her expensive leather handbag. She tried to deflect blame onto William, claiming ignorance of the broader financial strategy, but Elias immediately presented joint tax filings that carried her explicit authorization. There was no escape hatch, no convenient scapegoat to shoulder the blame. They were entirely trapped by their own documented greed, caught in a snare they had spent years weaving. The sheer humiliation of the exposure finally broke Caroline's composure. The carefully maintained mask of the sophisticated, aggrieved matriarch shattered, revealing the desperate, panicked woman beneath. Realizing the legal maneuvering was failing, she instinctively resorted to the only weapon she had left: emotional manipulation. She burst into violent theatrical sobs, tears streaming down her carefully powdered face. She leaned forward, ignoring Elias entirely, and directed her frantic performance straight at her daughter. Caroline played the ultimate card, crying out that she was her mother, that she had given her life, and that dragging her own parents through this devastating ordeal was an unnatural, unforgivable cruelty. She wailed about the sacrifices of motherhood, begging Madeline to remember the family bond and stop this relentless prosecution before it destroyed them all. Madeline did not blink. She did not offer a tissue or a single word of comfort. She sat in absolute silence, her expression carved from stone, watching the performance with clinical detachment. Elias, completely unfazed by the maternal hysterics, tapped his pen against a fresh manila folder. He ruthlessly shut down the emotional display, reminding Caroline that they were under oath, and instructed her to focus on the physical evidence. He opened the folder and presented Exhibit G. It was a verified dealership invoice accompanied by a cleared cashier's check drawn directly from the stolen trust fund account. Elias calmly asked Caroline to read the itemized description on the record. Caroline's sobs hitched in her throat. She stared at the paper, the color draining entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and ancient. The document proved that precisely 4 days after Madeline had been forced to take out a high-interest student loan to cover her sophomore tuition, William and Caroline had authorized a massive withdrawal from the supposedly empty trust. They had used Madeline's stolen college fund to purchase a brand-new, fully loaded Porsche for Sydney's 21st birthday. The exact dollar amount matched the illicit transfer down to the very last cent. Elias's voice was as cold as the room as he asked Caroline to explain how purchasing a luxury sports car for their youngest daughter constituted a necessary parental sacrifice. The brutal reality of the Porsche receipt extinguished any remaining spark of resistance. The undeniable cruelty of the theft, documented and recorded for eternity, hung over the room. There were no more tears, no more excuses, and no more defiant posturing. They were entirely out of maneuvers. Elias withdrew the settlement agreement from his briefcase. He placed it in the center of the table beside a cheap plastic pen. He reiterated the absolute terms. They would sign over the entirety of their remaining equity in their business, liquidating their last viable asset to repay the stolen funds, or they would face immediate criminal referral to the federal prosecutor for grand larceny and wire fraud. William stared down at the legally binding paper, feeling the crushing weight of his monumental failure. The logistics business was his identity, and the final crumbling pillar of his carefully curated social standing. Signing it away meant total, irrevocable bankruptcy. But the horrific alternative was a cold federal prison cell. He slowly reached out his hand, shaking violently, and took the pen. Without a word, he scratched his signature onto the dotted line. He defeatedly slid the stark document across the table to his trembling wife. Caroline blindly signed her name beside his. The ruthless settlement was officially executed. They had permanently traded everything they owned simply to avoid a looming federal indictment. Madeline gracefully stood up, adjusted her blazer, and walked out of the freezing room without ever looking back. While Madeline strode out into the crisp afternoon air, unburdened and victorious, her sister was suffocating under the collapsing weight of her own deceit. Sydney sat in the harshly lit corridor of the county family court, chewing her thumbnail down to the quick. She was completely isolated. Her parents were bankrupt, their assets seized, rendering them entirely useless to her. Jason was gone, banished to the underground to face the violent debt collectors he had tried to outrun. The criminal justice system was simultaneously circling her like a predator, preparing a devastating indictment for felony perjury and filing false police reports. Desperation, bitter and cloying, clawed at her throat. She was entirely broke, heavily pregnant, and staring down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence. Her last remaining lifeline was the man she had conspired to destroy. Sydney adjusted her maternity blouse, practicing a look of fragile victimhood, as the bailiff summoned her into the sterile hearing room. Terrence sat calmly at the respondent's table, flanked by a formidable team of corporate litigators paid for by his father's vast estate. He looked entirely indifferent, which terrified Sydney more than any shouted threat could. She took her seat across from him, flanked only by a public defender she had been forced to accept after her private counsel abandoned her due to unpaid invoices. The presiding judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, called the alimony hearing to order. Sydney immediately launched into her rehearsed performance. She bypassed her defender entirely, speaking directly to the bench with a trembling voice. She demanded a massive alimony settlement from Terrence. Her justification was a masterclass in manipulation. She claimed that the severe stress of the impending perjury charges, which she still vaguely attributed to a massive misunderstanding, was actively harming her unborn child. She painted Terrence as a cruel, neglectful monster who was abandoning his pregnant wife in her hour of greatest need. She demanded a monthly stipend that rivaled a corporate executive's salary, insisting it was his absolute legal and moral duty to finance her lifestyle and protect his alleged baby. Terrence let her speak. He watched her squeeze out crocodile tears, listening to her weave a tapestry of victimhood that blamed everyone but herself. When she finally finished her dramatic monologue, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, the judge turned a skeptical gaze toward the respondent's table. Terrence gave a subtle nod to his lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Sterling. Sterling stood up smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not waste time addressing Sydney's fabricated emotional distress. He simply approached the bench and handed the judge a sealed, certified medical document. Sterling announced for the official record that his client had requested and secured a court-ordered non-invasive prenatal paternity test weeks prior, utilizing a sample obtained during one of Sydney's routine medical examinations. The results had been fully expedited and verified by two independent federally accredited genetic laboratories. Sydney's fake tears vanished instantly. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. She gripped the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles turning white as icy panic crashed over her. She knew exactly what that envelope contained. The judge broke the seal, adjusting her glasses as she read the single-page report. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, thick with impending ruin. The judge looked up, her expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial contempt. She read the results aloud for the court reporter. The genetic markers were a definitive mismatch. There was a 0% probability that Terrence was the biological father of the child. The DNA profile definitively linked the unborn baby to a secondary sample Terrence's legal team had legally subpoenaed. The father was Jason. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Sydney opened her mouth to speak, to spin another lie, to formulate some impossible excuse, but no words came out. The absolute mathematical certainty of the genetic test cornered her completely. The intricate, malicious web she had spent months weaving to trap Terrence and secure a lifetime of unearned wealth had just been set on fire. Sterling capitalized on the devastating silence. He formally submitted the paternity results into evidence alongside a secondary, highly damning document. It was a certified copy of the pending felony indictment against Sydney for orchestrating the fraudulent domestic violence charges. He clearly laid out the legal reality. Sydney had committed egregious documented adultery, resulting in a pregnancy she then attempted to fraudulently pin on her husband for financial gain. Furthermore, she was facing severe criminal penalties for attempting to frame that same husband for a violent crime he never committed. The judge did not require further deliberation. She slammed her gavel down with a resounding crack. Her voice rang out with absolute finality, dismantling Sydney's demands piece by piece. The judge stated that the request for alimony was not merely denied. It was an insult to the judicial system. Under state law, documented adultery and the commission of a felony against a spouse were absolute bars to any form of spousal support. The judge threw out the alimony petition entirely, issuing a swift, brutal ruling that completely severed all of Terrence's financial obligations to the woman sitting across the room. Terrence stood up, buttoned his coat, and walked out of the courtroom, finally a free man. Sydney remained frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the polished wood grain of the table. The bailiff instructed her to gather her belongings and exit the premises. She stood up on trembling legs, walking out of the heavy double doors into the harsh fluorescent light of the public corridor. She had gambled everything on a malicious scheme of extortion and lies. Now, she was entirely stripped of her marriage, her safety net, and her false narrative. Sydney left the family court completely destitute, holding a purse containing exactly $0, with a felony criminal record waiting to swallow her future whole. While Sydney stumbled into the afternoon sun, her parents were barricaded inside their prized colonial mansion, suffocating under a different ruin. Surrendering their logistics business triggered an avalanche of catastrophes. Stripped of their income, William and Caroline watched their empire evaporate. Punitive damages drained their personal savings to bedrock. Their credit scores plummeted into the abyss, triggering default clauses across luxury cards. Worst of all was the mortgage on their sprawling estate. The massive payments had gone ignored for over 90 days. The bank sent warning letters and ultimatums, which William shoved into the bottom drawer of his desk. He spent his days in his darkened study nursing cheap scotch, paralyzed by the magnitude of their defeat. Caroline chose a radically different coping mechanism. Faced with total annihilation, her mind simply rejected the truth, barricading herself behind a fortress of sheer denial. If they were going to lose the house, she reasoned, they would not leave like beggars. They would exit as royalty. She decided to host one final, extravagantly lavish dinner party. It was a desperate attempt to keep up appearances to the bitter end. She dipped into a hidden cash reserve, funneling every dollar into hiring a premier catering company, a string quartet, and a private sommelier. William tried to stop her, pointing out the overdue notices covering the kitchen island. Caroline ignored him entirely. She glided through the cavernous hallways, directing florists to arrange massive centerpieces of imported white orchids. She polished the antique silver flatware until it gleamed her eyes wide and manic. She sent embossed invitations to the city elite country club board members and wealthy heirs they had spent decades aggressively courting. She instructed William to put on his tailored suit and pretend rumors of their business closure were simply the result of a lucrative corporate buyout. The evening of the party carried a crisp chill. The mansion was ablaze with light, every chandelier operating at maximum wattage, casting a defiant glow onto the manicured lawns. A fleet of luxury vehicles filled the circular driveway. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume. Caroline drifted through the crowded living room, gripping a glass of vintage champagne. She wore a stunning emerald gown, laughing too loudly at tepid jokes and aggressively topping off guest glasses. William stood by the marble fireplace, looking like a wax replica, offering stiff nods to an alderman questioning his sudden retirement. The elite guests were polite, but a palpable tension hummed beneath the classical music playing softly in the background. High society was built on gossip, and whispers of their sudden downfall had already begun to circulate. Yet her absolute insistence on opulence forced them to play along. She ushered everyone into the grand dining room, orchestrating the seating arrangements with militant precision. The hired waitstaff moved like ghosts, pouring expensive wine and serving courses on fine china. Caroline stood at the head of the long table, raising her glass to offer a toast. She spoke of new beginnings, closing chapters, and the enduring strength of friendships, her voice pitching higher with every word. Right as the guests raised their glasses in polite unison, a sharp, heavy pounding echoed from the front of the house. The rhythmic banging was loud enough to cut straight through the string quartet performance. Caroline dropped her smile. She signaled for a hired server to ignore the sound, attempting to seamlessly continue her toast. But the pounding intensified, heavy and authoritative, rattling the thick oak of the double doors. The local alderman lowered his glass, his brow furrowing in confusion. The string quartet slowly stopped playing, allowing the aggressive knocking to dominate the sudden suffocating silence of the dining room. William squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the dining table. He knew exactly what was waiting on the other side of that wood. Before Caroline could intercept them, two imposing men in dark windbreakers bypassed the confused catering staff in the foyer and stepped directly into the arched entryway of the dining room. They wore heavy utility belts equipped with radios, and their jackets bore the unmistakable insignia of the County Civil Division. They were flanked by a bank representative holding a thick clipboard and a heavy staple gun. The bank agent did not lower her voice or offer any discretion. She loudly verified the address and his identity, her words echoing off the vaulted ceilings. She formally announced that the property was in severe default and officially seized by the lending institution. With brutal efficiency, she handed the deputies a stack of neon orange legal notices. The elite guests sat paralyzed, forks hovering halfway to their mouths, watching the spectacle unfold in horrified fascination. The deputies stepped back out onto the front porch, the heavy doors propped wide open, allowing the freezing night air to sweep into the dining room. In full view of the most powerful socialites, the deputies utilized the staple gun. The loud metallic cracks echoed like gunshots as they drove staples directly into the pristine mahogany of the front doors. They attached massive, blindingly bright notices of public foreclosure and eviction. The fluorescent orange paper glared against the dark wood, broadcasting their total financial ruin. Caroline dropped her champagne flute. The crystals shattered against the imported rug, the vintage wine soaking into the fibers like blood. Her hands flew to her face, a strangled gasp escaping her throat. The guests immediately began exchanging uncomfortable glances, the polite facade evaporating instantly. A few subtly reached for their coats, desperate to escape the toxic fallout. The alderman abruptly stood up, murmuring a hasty excuse about an early morning meeting before slipping toward the side exit. William remained frozen at the fireplace, staring at the bright orange paper fluttering in the cold wind. Her desperate, manic delusion had shattered in the most spectacularly humiliating manner possible, leaving them with nothing but the hollow, echoing reality of their own destruction. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the courthouse steps, a rhythmic grating sound that seemed to mock the tension tightening in William's chest. The property, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been in his family for generations, stood silent and stoic in the background, its peeling paint and boarded-up windows seemingly unaware that its fate was being decided in mere minutes. William gripped Caroline's hand, his knuckles white. They had scraped together every cent they had, hoping that by some miracle an old family friend or a sympathetic local investor would win the bid and honor the informal agreement, purchase the house. Let them continue living in the modest carriage house out back and give them the time they desperately needed to find their footing. But the crowd told a different story. It wasn't filled with familiar neighbors or local benefactors. Instead, it was dominated by cold-faced representatives in tailored suits, men holding tablets and whispering into earpieces. When the bidding opened, it didn't start with the usual friendly banter of a local auction. It surged immediately into figures that made the air feel thin. William watched paralyzed as the price climbed past their absolute limit, then soared into territory that felt detached from reality. He looked at Caroline, whose face had gone pale, her eyes locked on the front door of the house as if waiting for the ghosts of her childhood to emerge and intervene. The final hammer fell with a sharp, sickening crack. The silence that followed was absolute. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped forward, not looking at the crowd, but directly at the court official handling the paperwork. As the man turned, the sunlight hit his face, and William felt his heart stutter in his chest. It was Elias. He had been a colleague of William's father years ago, a man who had vanished from their lives after the family business collapsed. A few paces behind him, a woman walked with the quiet, terrifying grace of someone who owned the world she stepped on. It was Madeline. She wasn't just a representative, she was the sole owner of the holding company that had just crushed their hopes. William moved forward, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Madeline, Elias, we had an agreement. We just needed a little more time." Madeline didn't even break her stride. She stopped only when she reached the foot of the stairs, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at them as victims. She looked at them as obstacles to be cleared. The representative beside her opened a heavy folder, the deed already drafted and waiting for a signature. "There was never an agreement, William," Madeline said, her voice smooth and devoid of malice, which made it all the more chilling. "You were living on borrowed time in a place you could no longer afford. I'm simply finalizing the transition." As Elias began to sign the documents, he finally made eye contact with them, a flicker of regret passing through his eyes before he hardened his expression. He knew exactly what this meant. Madeline wasn't here to renovate, to flip, or to preserve. Her plan was far more calculated. Within hours, legal notices would be taped to the doors of the carriage house. She had purchased the mansion to gut the history within its walls and replace it with a high-profile, subsidized housing center for women escaping domestic abuse. It was a noble cause, a public relations masterstroke that would make any attempt at protest look like an act of cruelty against the vulnerable. She hadn't just outbid them, she had weaponized their own moral compass against them. William stood frozen as the realization hit the home he had fought so hard to keep was gone, and there was no longer a version of his future where he was the one holding the keys. The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel hummed with the electric vitality of the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers refracted the light onto champagne flutes and silk gowns, creating an atmosphere of unattainable perfection. Madeline moved through the crowd like a queen, her presence commanding every room she entered. She wore a midnight blue gown that caught the low light, but it was her eyes, sharp and calculating, that drew the most attention. Beside her, Terrence stood as a pillar of support, his laughter mingling with hers as they chatted with a group of venture capitalists. He was no longer just a friend. He was an honored guest, his company's logo projected on the massive screens flanking the stage as a primary sponsor of the evening's tech initiative. Everything about the gala radiated success. The air smelled of expensive perfume and triumph. Madeline felt the familiar thrill of the game. She had dismantled William and Caroline's world without ever raising her voice, and tonight she was celebrating the culmination of her efforts. She leaned into Terrence, a small smile playing on her lips. They were the architects of a new order, and the room recognized it. Everyone here was a player, someone who understood the ruthless calculus of progress. She felt untouchable, a woman who had traded sentiment for total control. Just past the heavy oak doors, the reality was entirely different. William, Caroline, and Sydney crouched near a service entrance, their breath shallow and ragged. They looked like ghosts of their former selves. William's suit was wrinkled and smelled faintly of the damp basement-level apartment they now inhabited. Caroline's hair, once expertly styled, fell in loose, frazzled strands around her face, her eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of weeks spent tracking Madeline's every move. Sydney looked the worst of them. Her clothes were oversized, her face gaunt, her gaze darting toward every shadow. They had been living on meager rations, their only fuel, the resentment that had festered since the courthouse stairs. "We have one shot at this," William whispered, his hand trembling as he adjusted his collar. He checked his watch. The keynote presentation was about to begin. The security team was distracted, focused on the high-profile guests arriving at the main entrance. William had spent the last 3 days mapping out the gaps in their rotation. He knew the service corridors like the back of his hand, a vestige of the life he used to manage. They slipped through the heavy door, their movements stiff and unpracticed. The transition from the service hallway to the gilded splendor of the ballroom felt like stepping into a different dimension. As they entered the back of the hall, the transition was jarring. The contrast between the sterile fluorescent halls they had been living in and the opulent warmth of the gala made their heads spin. They moved with the frantic energy of the desperate, their eyes locked on the stage where Madeline stood. The ballroom was thick with onlookers, and the trio moved through the peripheral shadows unnoticed until they were just feet away from the front row. The keynote was finishing. Madeline had just signaled for the lights to dim. It was the moment of peak vulnerability. The cameras were fixed on the podium, and the media pool was ready. Caroline's resolve hardened. She didn't look at William. She didn't look at Sydney. She looked only at Madeline's back, at the graceful line of her spine. As the final notes of the introductory music faded, Caroline bolted. She bypassed the security cordon, her footsteps surprisingly silent on the plush carpet. Before the guards could react, she had breached the sanctity of the floor, sliding onto her knees with a dramatic practiced thud right in front of the press riser. She let out a piercing guttural sob that cut through the silence of the room like a jagged blade. It was a sound of absolute, unadulterated misery. "Madeline!" Caroline screamed, her voice breaking in a perfect manufactured cadence of heartbreak. "Please, I'm begging you, as a mother, as a woman, why have you turned your back on your own flesh and blood?" The effect was instantaneous. The dozens of cameras turned their shutters, clicking in a frenzied, unified chorus. Madeline froze mid-step, her back rigid. The color didn't drain from her face, but her posture became dangerously still. She knew better than to turn around immediately, but she also knew that the damage was already done. Caroline collapsed further, her forehead touching the carpet, her shoulders shaking violently. She kept wailing, the sound amplified by the hall's acoustics, weaving a tale of a sister cast aside of a family, pleading for the grace of reconciliation, of a daughter being held hostage by corporate greed. The room erupted in whispers. Cell phones were pulled out not to applaud but to record. The narrative of the evening was shifting from the brilliance of Madeline's tech firm to the spectacle of a broken family at her feet. Madeline felt the heat of 100 curious stares digging into her skin. She was being held accountable not for her crimes, but for the public perception of her character. Caroline's display was a trap, and she had sprung it with a lethal emotional precision. She didn't want the house back. She wanted Madeline's reputation to be the price of the eviction. William stood in the shadows watching the scene unfold with a grim, hollow satisfaction. He had provided the stage, and Caroline was delivering the performance of a lifetime. The gala, the wealth, the status, it all meant nothing if the public decided she was a villain. And in this moment, Caroline was making sure that was exactly what they saw. Madeline stood trapped by her own success, surrounded by cameras, with the desperate cry of a sister echoing off the gold-leafed walls. The ambush was absolute, and the audience was watching, waiting to see if the queen would break. The hum of the crowd shifted from intrigue to a suffocating heavy silence. Madeline remained still, her back to Caroline, watching the reflection of the ballroom in the polished glass of a display case. She took a breath, not of panic, but of sharp, icy clarity. Slowly, with measured deliberation, she turned around. She didn't look down at her sister kneeling on the floor. She looked past her, toward the sea of cameras and the expectant, hungry faces of the city's elite. With a steady hand, she reached out and took the microphone from the hands of a nearby event coordinator. The feedback whined for a fraction of a second before Madeline's voice smoothed it into an eerie, calm resonance that filled the entire space. "Ladies and gentlemen," Madeline began, her tone conversational, almost intimate. "I apologize for the unscripted theater. It seems that some individuals have mistaken my professional success for a community chest." She finally lowered her gaze to Caroline, who was still trembling on the carpet, her face a mask of practiced agony. "Caroline, please stand up. There is no need for such theatrical displays of piety when we both know the truth. You aren't here because you miss your sister. You are here because your bank accounts have finally reached the bottom of the barrel. The ballroom went deathly quiet. Even the servers stopped moving, the clatter of silver against china suspended in the air. Madeline stepped off the stage, walking toward her family, as if she were inspecting a failed product line. She stopped a few feet from them, her posture radiating an effortless, terrifying superiority. William, usually so prone to bluster, found himself unable to meet her eyes, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his threadbare coat. Sydney, standing near the back, looked like a frightened bird, her presence almost invisible against the backdrop of opulence. You've spent years portraying yourselves as the victims of my ambition. Madeline continued, her voice gaining a clinical, sharp edge. But let's be very clear about the nature of this performance. You didn't come to this gala to offer an olive branch or to seek a path to reconciliation. You came here tonight, hoping that if you shamed me enough in front of enough powerful people, I would write a check just to make the noise stop. It is a standard tactic for people who have run out of resources and lack the dignity to face their own failures. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The lack of emotion in her delivery was far more devastating than any shout. She pointed to William, then back to Caroline. I grew up in the same house you did. I faced the same cold, the same indifference, the same lack of opportunity. The difference between us isn't that I was luckier, it is that I was stronger. I walked away from the wreckage while you decided to build your lives inside the ruins and then blamed me for the collapse. She paused, looking directly at the cameras. To the press here tonight, I hope you have your footage. My family has spent their lives trying to curate an image of virtue. Tonight they have finally revealed their true selves. They are not my flesh and blood anymore. They are simply the people I had to survive to become who I am today, and as of this moment, they are strangers. She turned back to Caroline, her face a cool, detached mask. You are no longer welcome in my life. You are no longer welcome in my professional sphere. And you are certainly not welcome at my table. You came for my wallet, but you've only succeeded in forfeiting the last shred of my respect. Whatever resources you thought you could extract from me, consider them liquidated. A heavy, profound silence hung over the ballroom. The socialites who had been whispering moments ago now looked down, suddenly finding their champagne flutes fascinating. Madeline had effectively excommunicated them, and in doing so, she had established a boundary so sharp that no one in the room would dare cross it. To show support for the family now would be to side with desperate failures against a titan of industry. The social calculus was immediate and brutal. The elite had already decided where their loyalty lay. Madeline gave a curt nod to the head of security who had been waiting for a sign. Please escort these people out. They are trespassing on private property. William finally found his voice, a strangled, pathetic sound. Madeline, don't do this. We are your family. Think of what people will say. What people will say, Madeline replied, already turning back toward the stage, is that you are a cautionary tale. Two security guards approached, their presence large and imposing. They didn't need to use force. The sheer weight of the crowd's disdain was enough to deflate the trio. Caroline, still kneeling, looked around frantically, searching for a sympathetic eye in the crowd, but found only cold, judgmental stares. The performance had failed, and the realization hit her with more force than the eviction ever had. As she was hauled to her feet, her cries turned from calculated pleas into real, ragged sobs of shock. The guards led them toward the grand entrance. They didn't pass through the service corridors this time. They were marched straight through the center of the ballroom, a public procession of shame. Every guest turned away as they passed, effectively erasing them from the social register in real time. The air inside was warm and scented with luxury. The air outside, as the heavy doors swung open, was biting and bitter. The doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the warmth of the gala inside, and leaving the family standing on the concrete pavement. The sounds of the party, the soft music, the cultured laughter were muffled, distant, and finally completely gone. William, Caroline, and Sydney stood under the harsh glare of the streetlights, looking small, bedraggled, and utterly broken. They had come to destroy Madeline's life, but they had only succeeded in finalizing their own descent. They possessed nothing but the clothes on their backs and the cold realization that the bridges they had burned were now ash. The night air didn't just feel cold, it felt like a permanent climate, a new lonely reality where they were finally truly alone. Madeline hadn't just won the auction, she had reclaimed her history, and she had left them with nothing but the echo of their own desperation. The city skyline stretched out beneath Madeline's penthouse balcony, like a sprawling, glittering tapestry of light, a stark contrast to the dark, freezing pavement where she had last seen the faces of her past. 1 year had passed, a year that felt less like time and more like a deliberate construction of a new reality. She stood at the edge of the glass railing, a crystal flute of vintage champagne in her hand, the cool metal contrasting with the warmth of the evening air. Behind her, the penthouse was alive with the soft hum of genuine laughter and the gentle clinking of silverware against fine porcelain. This was not a gala, it was a sanctuary. Terence moved through the gathering with an ease he had never possessed before, his arm draped comfortably around Elena, a brilliant architect whose work Madeline had championed during the warehouse redevelopment project. They were a pair that made sense, built on shared values rather than the brittle transactional alliances Madeline had once navigated. Terrence's face, once haunted by the stress of his previous life, was now smooth and bright. He wasn't just Madeline's partner in business anymore. He was a partner in the life they had carefully built from the ground up, one where loyalty was the foundation, rather than the exception. Madeline's colleagues, the ones who had worked through the long, grueling nights to ensure the innovation hub opened ahead of schedule, sat at the periphery of the dining table, trading war stories of code deployments and design breakthroughs. They weren't just employees, they were the architects of her victory. She felt a profound sense of ownership, not just over the assets, but over this moment of serenity. She had learned that power was not simply the ability to command, but the ability to cultivate an environment where success felt inevitable and belonging felt earned. As the dinner progressed, the conversation turned toward the future of the innovation hub. There were no hidden agendas, no veiled threats, and no frantic scramble for status. Everyone at the table was there because they had contributed, because they were respected, and because they had weathered the storm of the previous year alongside her. Madeline caught Terrence's eye and he gave her a small, knowing nod. They had seen the worst of what people could do, the lengths to which desperate souls would go to reclaim a life that was never truly theirs to begin with. The epilogue of the antagonists was not a grand dramatic tragedy, but a series of slow, quiet descents into the mediocrity they had always feared. Jason had been the first to fade. The bankruptcy court had stripped him of every illusion of grandeur, leaving him with nothing but a series of mounting legal fees and a reality that demanded he show up for work before dawn. He now spent his days folding sweaters in a fluorescent-lit mall retail outlet, his charismatic smile replaced by a hollow, defensive blankness. He occasionally caught his reflection in the store's mirrored pillars, expecting to see a titan of industry but only finding a man who had bet everything on a lie and lost. Sydney's path had been equally bleak, though marked by a different kind of exhaustion. She had avoided prison time, but only by the skin of her teeth, sentenced to a strict term of probation that required her to report to a supervisor who didn't care about her excuses. She was a single mother now, the father of her child nowhere to be found, struggling to keep a cramped, drafty apartment heated while working graveyard shifts at a local shipping center. She didn't have time to scheme or plot. Her life was a singular, monotonous grind against the crushing weight of her own past choices. She watched the news, sometimes catching flashes of the Innovation Hub's success, and turned the television off before the images could make her lose her resolve. William and Caroline were perhaps the most tragic of all, not because they were punished, but because they were ignored. They lived in a basement flat, their lives defined by the relentless cycle of minimum wage shifts and the bitter memory of what they thought they were owed. They still clung to the social circles they had once frequented, attempting to show up at local charity events or dinners, hoping to remind the city of their former prominence. But the city had moved on. They were the people who had made a scene at a gala, the cautionary tale Madeline had promised they would become. Former acquaintances would look through them as if they were made of glass, and doors that had once opened at their touch remained firmly locked. They still had their pride, a brittle, sharp thing that cut them more than it protected them. Caroline would spend hours obsessing over old photos, trying to locate the moment where their life had pivoted, looking for a villain to blame, unaware that the villainy had been their own desire to possess instead of build. William spent his weekends scouring the real estate listings, his finger hovering over the properties he could no longer afford, his mind still trapped in the floor plan of the mansion that now served as a refuge for women rebuilding their lives. Madeline didn't hate them. Hate required an investment of emotion that they no longer merited. She simply viewed them with the clinical distance one might use to describe a weather pattern that had passed. They were the rain that had cleared the air. She set her glass down on the stone ledge and turned back to her guests, leaving the ghosts of her past to dwell in the basements and retail aisles of their own making. Terence walked up beside her, placing a hand on her waist. "You're thinking about them," he whispered. "I'm thinking about the view." Madeline replied, her gaze sweeping over the horizon. "Everything is exactly where it belongs." The laughter from inside intensified as Elena stood to propose a toast to the next phase of their innovation projects. Madeline took her place at the head of the table, feeling the weight of the past year lift completely. She wasn't an architect of someone else's mansion. She was the architect of her own peace. The dinner party continued late into the night, a celebration of the chosen family that had endured. The cost had been high, but the payoff a life defined by integrity growth, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had navigated the fire and emerged unburned was in the end worth every single sacrifice. The most profound lesson from this journey is that true worth is never defined by the people who fail to see your potential. I spent years seeking validation from those who only valued me as an extension of their own agendas, only to realize that real empowerment begins when you stop begging for a seat at tables where you aren't wanted. By creating your own space, you define your legacy through integrity and action, rather than waiting for permission from the gatekeepers of your past. Have you ever had to forge your own path after being underestimated? Leave a comment below sharing your experience.